Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and begin our archetype breakdown for Core Set 2021, which comes out in about a week or two. We'll be playing mostly on Arena, I imagine, since stores still aren't open, but I want to go ahead and get these out there and kind of break down the different archetypes that we'll be drafting for Core 2021. This is a core set, so thankfully things are pretty much on rails. With Ikoria, there was a little bit of a shake-up where there were 3 color decks and different archetypes floating around different color pairs, but for the core set, we're back to basics with each of the 2 color pairs being the highlight of the set, most of which are pretty straightforward when you look at the gold cards and the different cards floating around the set. We are going to start off with 2 black archetypes, black red and black white, which are pretty typical archetypes that we're used to seeing in core sets now. So that's the game plan, 2 archetypes per video, try to make them a little bit shorter. Again, I moved to this kind of format for archetype reviews and set reviews just because it doesn't really benefit too many people to go over every single card in the set, and we can do it in little bite-sized pieces. So what do you say we go ahead and jump in? We're going to start things off with black-red, which is typically a sacrifice deck and is also a sacrifice deck in Core Set 2021. So we're looking for a mix of creatures that are expendable, creatures that have death triggers, things like that, cheap creatures, token fodder, and we're looking for ways to exploit those creatures by sacrificing them to other effects. Now, the way these videos are going to pan out and the way I'm going to look over each archetype is I'm going to look at the gold card first. For most of these archetypes, there is a single gold uncommon. A couple of the color pairs have an additional rare, but we're going to look at the gold uncommon for each archetype, which is kind of your signpost. It tells you what the archetype is supposed to be doing. And then we'll look at a couple of the rares that might push you into this specific archetype, or the type of rare that would incentivize you to start drafting this archetype, or just will be better in this archetype than any other archetype in the set. And then finally, we'll look over the payoffs for the cards and the enablers for that archetype. So, starting with black-red, the uncommon is Dire Fleet Warmonger. This is 1 black and a red for a 3/3 uncommon Orc Pirate. And it says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, Dire Fleet Warmonger gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So very clearly, just right off the bat, an uncommon that says, hey, you want to be sacrificing creatures. Now, this is a fine card because it is a 3-mana 3/3, and those always tend to stand on their own just fine. But the fact that this can attack as a 5/5 trampler is pretty strong, but you do need to be sacrificing things that want to be sacrificed, or your opponent's creatures, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This card's fine, and it's obviously just very good because it passes the vanilla test and can only go up from there. But keep in mind with this card or anything else that requires you to sacrifice cards to really get it going, if you're just sacrificing cards left and right, that's not going to pan out. You lose a lot of board presence doing that. So make sure if you're using this ability that you are sacrificing creatures that give you some sort of benefit, or a stolen creature or something along those lines. Don't just sacrifice, a 2/2 on board to get an extra 2 damage in, unless that's really going to push the game in your favor. Otherwise, you will fall behind. And that goes for anything else that requires you to sacrifice creatures for some sort of advantage. Now, speaking of rares, there's not very many. In fact, there's not really a rare in the entire set that pushes you to want to be a sacrifice deck, but there are a couple rares that get a little bit better when you are sacrificing your own creatures. One of those is Gadrick, the Crown Scourge. This is 2 and a red for a 5/4. It is a rare flying dragon, so 3 mana 5/4 flyer. It cannot attack unless you control 4 or more artifacts. Now, there's not really an artifact theme in this set, so that's not going to happen very likely unless you're triggering the last ability, which says, at the beginning of your end step, create a treasure token for each non-token artifact, or rather non-token creature that died this turn. So if creatures are dying on your end step, you'll get treasure tokens, and if you manage to get up to 4 treasure tokens or 4 artifacts altogether, Gadrick can start attacking, even though Gadrick can block at all times, which makes it a fine card, right? A 3-mana 5/4 blocker, even if it had Defender and flying, would be good. The fact that this can sometimes attack makes it even better. So don't look at the downside too harshly. This is still a good card, even if it doesn't ever attack. It's still just fine. The reason this obviously fits into red-black sacrifice a little bit better than it would otherwise is because you will often be sacrificing your own creatures and triggering Gadric by your own means, right? The idea behind Gadric is that creatures engage in combat, they trade off, and then you get some treasure token on your end step to reward you for trading off creatures. But if you can facilitate that by sacrificing your own creatures and triggering Gadric yourself, that's fine too. And Gadric just gives you extra mana, right? The treasure tokens don't necessarily have to stay on board for Gadric to start attacking. You can use those for extra mana or anything that lets you sacrifice a permanent, which we'll see a couple other cards here. So Gadric, fine card. I think first pick quality card. Doesn't necessarily say, hey, draft red-black on it, but does pay you off a little bit if your creatures are dying throughout the course of a game. The other rare I wanted to mention here is Liliana's Standard Bearer, which is a card that'll pop up a couple more times throughout this series. It is 2 and a black for a 3/1 rare zombie knight. It has flash, so 3 mana, 3/1 flash, and when it enters the battlefield, draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures that died under your control this turn. Also, a very solid card that you would play in any black deck, but again, if you are sacrificing your own creatures, if you're causing creatures to die on your own terms, then you can use Liliana's Standard Bearer to good effect, even though I imagine this card just has to be good in basically any black deck. So moving on to our payoffs and our enablers, there's a lot to talk about here, and obviously any card that has the word sacrifice on it is going to play into this archetype. We're not looking at literally every single card, but the ones that are better in this archetype than they are in just any general red and or black deck. The first one I want to talk about is Hobble Fiend. This is 1 in a red for a 2/1 common devil. It has trample, and it says for 1 mana, sack another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Hobble Fiend. 2 mana, 2/1 trample that can get bigger and also enable sacrifice synergies. This card is fine. In fact, this is probably your go-to common for this deck if you're looking to sacrifice your creatures. It has actual board presence, and it is basically the only common in this set that can repeatedly sacrifice creatures. That might not be true, but for the most part, this is going to be the bread and butter card that you want for this archetype. It does take a little while to get going. You need to get a couple counters on this before it's a fantastic card, but as a baseline 2 mana 2/1 with upside, it's pretty good, and the activated ability is cheap enough to activate that it's not completely horrendous to have to activate it multiple times in the same turn. We've also got Witch's Cauldron, which is a single black mana for an uncommon artifact, and it says 1 in a black, tap it and sacrifice a creature, you gain a life and draw a card. We're actually quite used to having an effect like this in most limited sets these days. We just got done playing with Bushmeat Poacher, which is a lot better than this card, but we've also had cards like Spark Reaper and Soul Reaper of Mogus from Theros Beyond Death. You know, these standard effects on commons or uncommons that let you sack a creature, gain a tiny bit of life, and draw a card. This is a little bit of a different take on it because it is on an artifact, so you can't actually sacrifice this to other effects, but it is less vulnerable to removal. I do think you'll play this card. In fact, I think you'll play this card in most decks, not just the sacrifice deck, but it's obviously at its best here if you can get some sort of fodder going. Again, you don't want to sacrifice real creatures to this effect unless they're about to die to a removal spell or something along those lines, but if you have expendable creatures on board, this is a good way to turn them into extra advantage. That's usually the best way to make these decks operate, is to use your sacrifice effects to draw into extra cards and get a little bit of a benefit off of it as you go. So interesting card. I think this card is going to play out well. It is uncommon, so you won't see it too likely, and it doesn't really stack in multiples. You don't want more than one of these because these effects do start to compete with each other, and having multiple Witch's Cauldrons on board is not really a successful game plan. So keep an eye out for that one. We've also got Village Rites, which is a single black mana for a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. So we're used to seeing Altar's Reap in sets, which is the same exact card for 2 mana. This is just a single black, and keeping up a single black to blank a removal spell, sack the creature your opponent was targeting, and draw 2 cards is very good. I think this card is actually quite sweet. I'm already a big fan of Altar's Reap in Limited, just because creatures do get targeted and you do have expendable creatures so often. Village Rites is even cheaper than that, and I think as far as just a sacrifice payoff that requires you to, lose something and go up on cards is just fine. This card will play out perfectly well, I think, even though I don't think you want a bunch of them in your deck. Crypt Lurker is a 3/4 for 3 and a black. It's a common horror, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature or discard a creature card. If you do, draw a card. This card's just fine. Again, it gives you the option to sacrifice a creature and turn that into something else. I think most black decks will be happy to play this card since it lets you discard creatures. It lets you cycle away a bad creature in the late game to draw into another card, but also lets you sacrifice a creature you don't care about on board. It doesn't give you too much of an advantage. It just gives you a one-time cycle, but the body's good enough. I think you'll play this card and you'll be happy with it. Gourmand, we will see this card actually quite often throughout this series because it is just a fantastic uncommon. It is 4 black for a 5/5 uncommon demon. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature. It has flying and trample, and it says when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So, base value, 6 mana, 5/5, Flampler, and it makes everybody sack a creature. You sack one to cast it, and then when it enters battlefield, everybody else sacks a creature. So this card is obviously very strong. In fact, there are cards very similar to this in past core sets that are rare. They don't usually require you to sacrifice a creature, but think something like Demon of Catastrophes from M19. That card was a rare, and it's not that much better than Gourmand. In fact, some might argue it's worse than Gourmand, since that card didn't have the ability to make your opponent sacrifice a creature. Gourmand's very powerful. Again, you'll play this in basically any black deck. It's not specific to the red-black deck, but the fact that you do sacrifice a creature means that you can possibly turn that into an advantage where it will actually be a little bit of a downside for other decks. Havoc Jester is a new riff on Mayhem Devil from War of the Spark. It is 4 and a red for a 5/5 uncommon devil, and it says whenever you sacrifice a permanent, it deals 1 damage to any target. Now, yes, it's very easy to compare this to Mayhem Devil, but just keep in mind, Mayhem Devil triggered off your opponent's stuff sacking. Havoc Jester only triggers off of you sacking, so it's not a direct one-for-one comparison. Also, 5 mana, 5/5, pretty good stats, especially in red. That's just good, solid creature with a little bit of upside. Even if you don't sacrifice permanents, that's fine, vanilla creature. And if you do get to the point where you sacrifice permanents, as I think Mayhem Devil taught everybody, you can throw around some damage, usually a couple damage in the same turn, and kill off creatures, or just send it to your opponent's face. Anytime you sack to any ability, you get an extra ping. And if you can add those up, you can actually use this as creature removal. So I like Havoc Jester, and there's only really one other archetype that wants the card, the red-green 4 power matters archetype. So Havoc Jester, not a card that I think people are going to be super interested in, but seems like it'd be really good in the red-black deck here. Malefic Scythe is an interesting card. It's 1 and a black for an uncommon equipment artifact. It enters the battlefield with a soul counter. It costs 1 mana to equip, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each soul counter on the Scythe. So just base value, 2 mana for an artifact that has equip 1 and gives the equipped creature +1/+1. But whenever the equipped creature dies, you put a soul counter on the Malefic Scythe. So every time the equipped creature dies, the Scythe will grant a bigger bonus. The first time a creature dies, you re-equip this, that creature's getting +2/+2 for just a single mana to re-equip. Obviously, you need to get a couple counters on this, really just 1 additional counter on it for it to be that good, which shouldn't be that hard. I think this card was geared more towards the green-black deck, which cares about creatures dying, but there's some obvious synergy with the red-black deck, where if you can equip this to a cheap creature that you're about to sacrifice, you can just get an additional soul counter on it for 1 additional mana. That's all it costs to re-equip this. A little bit to get going, but once you get a couple counters on it, this makes anything you put on the battlefield an actual threat, and you can facilitate getting extra soul counters on it yourself by just sacrificing equipped creatures. So I like it. This I have kind of bookmarked as a potentially broken limited card, but it takes a little bit of work, and we'll have to see how it plays out before I actually just give it the stamp of approval that this card is really good. Traitorous Greed is our act of treason type effect for the set, and I'm a little disappointed in it. Now, the card's fine. It's 3 and a red. For an uncommon sorcery, you gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, gains haste, but then you add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. So it costs 4 mana, which is on the expensive side for these sorts of effects, but it refunds you 2 mana back, which you can use for any of the sacrifice outlets that you have on board. Obviously, in the red-black deck, this is the card that you're looking for. In fact, red-black sacrifice decks in Limited basically live or die on this effect. If there is a good active treason type effect in the format, then the red-black sacrifice decks go way, way up in value. And if there isn't, then they lose a lot of their appeal. The unfortunate thing here is that even though this card is good, it gives you 2 mana back that you can use to sacrifice the creature that you're stealing for the turn. It's an uncommon, which I think really, really hurts this archetype. In fact, I think that is so big of a deal that you just won't see the red-black deck in action too often. Every now and then you will, but I believe, if I look through everything right, this is the only card in the entire set that can steal your opponent's creature for a turn, outside of maybe a rare or two. And that's just a little bit unfortunate that that's an uncommon effect, even though the power level of the card doesn't seem like it's uncommon. I don't think this card is that amazing, but if you are playing red-black sacrifice, you will have to take this card whenever you see it in a draft. Otherwise, it might not come back, and it will add a significant power level to your deck. Being able to steal your opponent's creature, sacrifice it, and use it for some sort of benefit is just a huge game swinger in Limited. Great way to take care of a bomb, and unfortunately, Uncommon makes it less likely that you'll be able to do that in this archetype. Goblin Wizardry is a card I wanted to mention here. It's 3 and a red for a common instant, and it says create 2 1/1 red Goblin Wizard creature tokens with prowess. Now, the fact that they have prowess is not too big of a deal here for the purposes of red-black, but I just wanted to mention this because it is a single card that can give you 2 bodies, and any card that gives you multiple bodies is going to be a little bit better in red-black than just a generic red deck, simply because it gives you more sacrifice fodder. Liliana's Devotee is very similar in the same vein. It's 2 and a black for a 2/3 uncommon human warlock. It gives your zombies +1/+0, which isn't a huge deal. But more importantly, it says at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1 and a black. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This is actually a nice little self-contained engine. If you have this on board, and you have plenty of mana, and you have something worth sacrificing, you can sacrifice that creature. Devotee will trigger on the end step, and you can make a zombie, and then you can repeat that process with the zombie each following turn by just sacrificing the zombie that this made, triggering the ability on the end step, and basically that zombie will keep replacing itself. Now, you only get to do this once per creature that died, and it is a little bit mana intensive since you're paying 2 for this and probably mana for whatever you're sacrificing that creature to, but it is a nice little way to make sure you always have something worth sacrificing and pays you back, while also being just a decent card. Remember that the zombie token you make off this ability will be getting +1/+0, so this is a 3 mana 2/3 that often makes 3 2s on your end step. Seems pretty decent to me, although I do think this is going to be a high pick card for multiple archetypes. Basically, any black deck will be happy to play this, so don't expect to get this one late. Deathbloom Thallid is back, 2 and a black for a 3/2 common fungus, and when it dies, you make a 1/1 sapling creature token. Again, 2 bodies for the price of 1. Not too much to talk about. This card is fine. You're not clamoring to have it, but if you're in a red-black sacrifice deck, you're pretty happy with it. And there's also Goblin Arsonist, which is a single red mana for a 1/1 common Goblin Shaman. When it dies, you may have it deal 1 damage to any target. Not a high priority card, but this is the type of creature that wants to die and can ping off creatures when combined with something like Havoc Jester, whatever the card was called, or any of these sacrifice effects. If this can ever ping an opponent's creature, it's quite powerful, especially if you can give it Death Touch before it goes out. Not a high priority card. You don't want a bunch of these in your deck, but you'll play a couple in this deck. You'll be a little bit more excited about it than you would by playing a Goblin Arsonist in basically any other red deck. And that brings us to our second archetype. That's going to be black-white, and again, black-white is your life gain deck. Now, M19 and M20 also had black-white life gain decks, but outside of a couple key cards, there really wasn't a lot to push the archetype. It was more of a minor synergy or like a micro synergy in the set than it was a full-on deck. And I think that's a little bit different in this core set. It seems like they really wanted black-white synergies to come together, so we're going to see a couple more payoffs and enablers for that than we have in previous core sets. Now, the uncommon here is actually very powerful. It is 1 white-black. Sorry, the card is Indulging Patrician. 1 white-black for a 1/4 fly-in lifelinker at uncommon. It's a vampire noble. And it says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, each opponent loses 3 life. And we're going to see that a lot. That this isn't really, or the archetype in this set doesn't really necessarily care about just gaining life. It specifically cares about gaining 3 or more life. So we're going to be talking about that when we look at the payoffs. You want to make sure that you can gain 3 life in a single turn. So just gaining 1 or 2 isn't quite going to do it. Sometimes you need to combine together separate life gain effects to make sure you hit that threshold. But if you're gaining 3 life per turn, you're going to be triggering your payoff cards here. This card on its own, very powerful. Obviously, it doesn't trigger its own ability unless you can grow it with an aura or something like that. But 3 mana 1/4 lifelink flyer is a card I'm already very happy to play. And if you're in black-white and sometimes you can drain your opponent out for just gaining life, very powerful. Also very good in multiples, and I don't think it's quite strong enough that you'll be splashing this in other colors unless you have a significant life gain effect in those colors. So if you're a black-white drafter and you manage to cut off a lot of the life gain synergies, you should be rewarded with this card. If you can ever get 2, your deck is probably amazing. So Indulgent Patrician, kind of a standout card for the archetype, as it should be, as one of the gold uncommons. As for rares, we have Speaker of the Heavens, which is a single white mana for a 1/1 rare human cleric. It has Vigilance and Lifelink. 1 mana, 1/1 Vigilance, Lifelink. Still not quite sold on that. 1 mana, 1/1, even with a couple of positive abilities, isn't quite doing it for me. But there's some actually massive upside on this card. It says tap, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with fly-in. No mana to activate that ability, just tap, make a 4/4 flyer. But of course, there's a caveat. It says activate this ability only if you have at least 7 life more than your starting life total, and only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So you need to be in limited at least 27 life in order to activate this. Now the joke, of course, is that this card has lifelink and it can help you get there, but I think people should not overrate how hard it is to get up to 27 life. If your opponent sees this card, A, they can just kill it. It dies to basically anything in the entire set. B, they can just attack your life total and make sure that you never get above 27. Of course, sometimes the board will stall out or you've gained enough life that this card will start tapping and making angels, which makes it insane. I'm leaning on the side of saying that this card is not a bomb. It is not a card you should first pick, but if you're drafting black-white and you see this card a little bit later in the pack, that you should take it and you should probably play it. Just don't overrate that ability. There are not that many games where you're going to get to 27 life and just take over with this card, even though if you do get to that point, you will probably just win the entire game off the back of your 1-drop, which is kind of insane, right? Now, Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, is a card that you should play and be extremely happy with it, and probably first pick as well. It's 2 and a black for a 1/3 rare legendary vampire cleric. So 3 mana 1/3, not great, but it does say whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. We call that the Sanguine Bond ability, right? Whenever you gain life, your opponent takes just as much damage. So if you hit them with a 2/2 lifelinker and Veto is on board, your opponent will lose 2 life. If you have an ability that just gains you 3 life, Veto will trigger, your opponent will lose 3 life, right? Every instance of life gain turns into damage as well. So just having a Veto sit on board while you're gaining life and activating your synergies and doing things like that is very powerful, even if the 1/3 body doesn't really engage in combat that well. Veto also has a 5 mana activated ability, 3 black, creatures you control gain a lifelink until end of turn. Now that's actually pretty huge for 2 reasons. First off, you can just never lose a race sometimes with an effect like this. Give your entire board lifelink and just swing at your opponent. You're going to gain so much life that your opponent is not going to be able to attack you back most times and kill you. You can use it on defense as well, just to make sure that your defensive creatures are gaining you extra life whenever your opponent's attacking into you. The second reason that's huge is because of the triggered ability. Sometimes you will just win the game by activating this ability. You will give all of your creatures lifelink, you'll attack for 7, 8, 9 damage, something along those lines, and your opponent might be able to block, they might be able to even eat some of your creatures, but not only are you going to deal combat damage with the unblocked creatures, but you're going to gain a butt ton of life off of Veto's ability, since you just gave everything lifelink. And Veto will trigger, your opponent will essentially lose twice as much. If your creatures go unblocked while Veto's on board and you activate the 5 mana ability, your creatures are essentially dealing double damage while you're gaining life, which pushes a game way out of range. I think Veto is extremely powerful. I think the 3 mana 1/3 is going to deter some people, and I do think if I have Veto in my deck, I am looking to push in the black-white life gain direction. Not a super bomb by any means, doesn't necessarily just win on its own, but with the right support, this is an extremely powerful rare to start a draft off with. And finally, Baneslayer Angel. Baneslayer Angel, we know this card, or at least if you've played Magic anytime in the last couple of years, you probably know what this card is, but it's very similar to Lyra Dawnbreaker, if you're aware of that card. 3 white for a 5/5 Mythic Angel with fly-in, first strike, lifelink, and, for some reason, protection from demons and from dragons. You can ignore most of that. This is just a giant fly-in lifelinker. First strike doesn't even come up that often with this, and honestly, yes, you'll play this in your black-white deck. You'll be happy about it, but the life gain synergy is a very minor thing here. If you are winning the game with a Baneslayer Angel, it really doesn't matter too much whether you're triggering your other abilities or not. Baneslayer is just a super bomb card. You're very happy to have it. You'll first pick it and play it in every single white deck, and yes, you might draft a couple extra life gain synergies to go along with it, but it doesn't need any help. This card is fantastic. That brings us to our payoffs and our enablers, which there's quite a bit to talk about here. Now, keep in mind, as we'll see with a lot of the payoff cards, that black-white cares about gaining 3 life per turn. It's not necessarily just gaining life, even though there are some cards that trigger off just gaining life. But for the most part, if you're drafting this deck, you want to sway your picks in the direction of taking cards that can gain chunks of 3 life at a time, which are the ones we're going to talk about here. We're not going to talk about every lifelink creature in the set or everything that can gain life, because you really want to push yourself in the direction of making sure you're gaining chunks of 3 life at a time. Now, starting off with the payoffs, we have Griffin Airy, which is 1 and a white for an uncommon enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 2/2 white Griffin creature token with flying. So the enchantment on its own does absolutely nothing. If you're not gaining life, this just sits here and it doesn't do anything. At your end step, if you've gained 3 life, you get a 2/2 flyer. Trigger this one time and it makes up for itself, right? Now, of course, if you play this and it's not until turn 5 or 6 that you get your 2/2, you could probably do better. Or if you, throughout the course of a game, only get 1 2/2 off of this, it's not that great. But this has some major upside. The fact that this can make multiple 2/2s throughout a game is great. If you ever make 1 2/2, you kind of got a decent card. If you make more than 1 2/2 throughout the course of a game, this card is bonkers. And the fact that it can sometimes get out of hand and make multiple 2/2s turn after turn after turn is very strong. It's also the type of card that other decks just don't want. So it's the type of card that if you're in black-white and if you pushed in that direction pretty hard and cut players out, other people might not be interested in this card. You might be able to wheel it in certain drafts. So just keep that in mind as well with these payoff cards. Again, this does nothing on its own. You need to make sure you're triggering it, but you'll know when you want this in your deck. If you have 4 or 5 ways in your deck to gain just 3 life per turn, and maybe other ways to gain life that can combine together to give you 3 life per turn, then yeah, you should play this card. It is quite powerful. But if you're looking at maybe 2 or 3 ways in your entire deck to gain 3 life, this is not the payoff you're looking for. Silver Smoked Ghoul is 2 and a black for a 3/1. It's an uncommon zombie vampire, whatever that is. And it says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, return Silver Smoked Ghoul from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, I just want to note there, because I was a little confused, this card doesn't enter the battlefield tapped. It only enters tapped if it came back from the graveyard with this ability. So just keep that in mind. If you play this card from your hand, it is untapped, and you can trade it off and so on and so forth. So it can block, which cards like this often have a small caveat on not being able to block. It also has 1 and a black, sacrifice Silver Smoke Ghoul, draw a card. Okay, so the nice little package here, the idea is that you pay for 3 mana for a 3/1, which isn't great, but you can trade it off. Usually you can get a card out of a 3/1 one way or another, or you can just sacrifice it to its own effect to cantrip it into another card, which is expensive, but it is upside nonetheless, so shouldn't be ignored. And then if at some point during your turn, you can gain 3 life, you're going to get this card back to the battlefield. And it will be tapped, but then you can sacrifice it again to draw a card and kind of get this chain going is the idea here. Now, one thing I want to mention about these effects is that they trigger only on your turn and they trigger at the beginning of your end step. So if you are an arena player or you are playing in real life, make sure if you're going to do some sort of shenanigans to gain life that you don't wait until your end step to do it. Make sure you do it by your second main phase or something like that. Because if you wait until your end step and then you cast like an instant that gains 3 life, these abilities will not trigger because the beginning of your end step has already passed. So do these sorts of effects before you get to your end step. Set stops on arena if you have to on your second main phase to make sure that you're gaining your life before you actually get to your end step. As far as the goal goes, I think this is a high priority card for most black decks. Again, this is not like Griffinary. You will not wield this card that often because it is just a nice little value engine to have in a black deck. And I think the card's good. You should be happy to take this. And even if you're not triggering this one multiple times, it does stand on its own just fine, unlike Griffinary, which is very specific to the black-white deck. Sanguine Indulgence is 3 and a black for a common sorcery, and it says it costs 3 less to cast if you've gained 3 or more life this turn. Okay, what does it do? It says return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Now, I really like these effects in Limited. They let you play an extremely grindy game and give you back a bunch of advantage, and when you cast them for full value and you get 2 creatures back, it's like a divination, right? It's like a draw 2, but you always draw cards that you're happy to get back. You never draw lands or anything like that. Now, 4 mana is too much for this effect, but 1 mana is extremely underpriced for this effect. So this is the type of card that I would kind of hold off and wait until I know I can cast it for 1 mana instead of firing it off for 4 mana, right? This is also the type of card that's nice with little lifelink creatures because you can send in small lifelink creatures, which will often just die in combat, but then you can make sure you've gained 3 life, cast this card for 1 mana, and get the creatures back that just died in combat, right? This one is fine. You'll play it in some other decks, but for the most part, it's expensive enough without the life gain clause that I think you can wheel this card pretty regularly in this format. And we'll see how it plays out. If grindy games are the way to go in this format, then Sanguine Indulgence is going to be just fine. Obviously, going to be at its best in the black-white deck. Light of Promise, 2 and a white for an uncommon aura. It enchants a creature, and it says, enchanted creature has, whenever you gain life, put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature. Now, this is the type of card that I will never play, but I will lose to quite often. It has a huge upside, right? If you play this on a creature and then it has a lifelink, that creature gets way out of hand. It just basically doubles its power every turn. If you are gaining 3 life and putting 3 +1/+1 counters on the creature every time you do that, it's pretty good. But it's also the type of aura that if your opponent 2-for-1s you, it's a massive blowout and you get no value off of it. Very similar to Hydra's growth in Theros Beyond Death, but requires even more work since you need to be repeatedly gaining life. If this just gives 2 +1/+1 counters in the course of the game, that's not good. If it gives 3 +1/+1 counters, that's not even really worth the extra work. You need to be getting something like 4, 5, 6 counters on the card, and you're often not doing that the same turn you play Light of Promise because this is a 3 mana aura. So honestly, this card has some huge upside. There are some games that will be won off the back of Light of Promise. It'll be frustrating to lose to it, but I'm going to stand my ground on this one and say you should not be playing Light of Promise in this format. Blood Glutton is up next. 4 and a black for a 4/3 lifelinker. It's a vampire, it's a common, and that's it. 5 mana 4/3 lifelinker. That's not a fantastic card. In fact, that's not even really that good of a card. The reason I'm mentioning it here is because outside of some rares, things like Baneslayer Angel, this is the only card in the entire set that has lifelink that also has 3 or more power without granting a lifelink with some sort of ability, right? Some sort of instant or things like that. There are ways to give other creatures lifelink, but Blood Glutton is the only way that can gain 3 life on its own by just attacking or blocking, which is not significant. It doesn't mean that you will play this card in this deck quite often just to make sure you're enabling your other cards. If you can attack with a Blood Glutton, trade something off, make sure it kills something, gain 4 life, and then trigger something like your Griffinary at end of turn, then sure, you'll be happy with it. But it's not a great rate. Lifelink doesn't make this card that much better than it would be otherwise. I just think you'll be playing this card because there are a lack of other giant lifelinkers in this set. Aven Gagglemaster is 3 white for a 4/3 uncommon bird warrior with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life for each creature you control with flying. This doesn't quite do it on its own, but you really only need to gain 1 other life in order for Gagglemaster to trigger your ability. But I wanted to mention it here because if you have another flyer on board and you play Gagglemaster, you will gain 4 life, possibly 6 or more life if you have a bunch of flyers. and this does meet that threshold of a card that could possibly gain you 3 or more life in a single turn. That being said, Aven Gagglemaster is a very powerful card, possibly one of those second, third pick type uncommons in the set, so don't expect to get this one late like you would, say, a Blood Glutton. And Revitalize is back as well, a card that I thought was miserable to play, not something you should have been happy to play in other limited decks. But here, it does give you that 3 life, which is important for this deck. Those of you who don't know, Revitalize is 1 and a white for a common instant. Gain 3 life, draw a card. Kind of one of those cards that just wastes time, right? It doesn't really do anything. It does help you not die against a fast aggro deck, but it doesn't really get you anywhere on board. It just replaces itself and buffers your life total a little bit. It's a little bit more powerful here, and in fact, if you are in black-white and you have cards like the Patrician or the Griffinary, you'll probably play every single copy of Revitalize that you can get your hands on, and it's not a card that a lot of other decks will be interested in. So again, black-white, we're seeing a theme here that if you're in this archetype and other players aren't in specifically black-white, you should be able to wheel a lot of the cards that you want that make the deck tick. Tavern Swindler is back again as well. It's 1 in a black for a 2/2 uncommon human rogue, and God, I hate this card. It says tap, pay 3 life, flip a coin. If you win the flip, you gain 6 life. That's the entire card. If you've never played with Tavern Swindler, the only reason you would activate that ability is because you're either massively ahead or you're trying to trigger something. You're trying to make sure that you gain that life for some sort of benefit. You get the joke here, right? You can gain 6 life and trigger your life gain payoffs, but you can't guarantee that happens, which makes me hate this card. Now, it's a 2-mana 2/2, and sometimes you'll activate the ability and sometimes you'll get paid off. Sometimes you'll activate the ability and you'll just be down 3 life and you'll have nothing to show for it. But the fact that this is a 2-mana 2/2 means that the tap ability is upside. You don't have to activate the ability. So if you're in a life gain deck, you will probably play this card, but you won't activate the ability when you're in danger, right? It does lead to some cool stories and stuff like that, but the ability is more of a trap than anything else. Now, if I have my Griffinary on board and I have my Indulgent Patrician or whatever the card is called on board, then yeah, I'm going to activate this ability. And I'm going to be a little bit sad when I lose, but the payoff is definitely going to be there when I win. I hate this card, but it does have a place in this deck, and we wanted to mention it there. Just don't underrate the card because it is a bear. It is a 2-mana 2/2. Just don't overrate the ability either, and don't activate it unless you have a reason for doing so. Faith's Fetters is reprinted here. Very happy to see this one. Fantastic limited card. It's 3 and a white for an uncommon aura. It enchants a permanent. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. So there you go, just off the bat, meeting your threshold. And the enchanted permanent can't attack, block, or activate abilities unless they're mana abilities. And I do just want to I just want to make sure people are aware, if you haven't played with Faith's Fetters, that you can put it on non-creature permanent. So if your opponent has a Planeswalker on board, you can put Faith's Fetters on it, and it will stop that Planeswalker from being able to activate abilities. Just a minor thing that comes up every now and then. You can put it on a land that has a special ability, which there aren't too many of in this format, and stop the activated ability. At any rate, 90% of the time you're going to put this on a creature. It's going to arrest that creature. It's going to stop that creature from being relevant, and it's going to gain you that 4 life. If you can Faith's Fetters an opponent's creature and also trigger one of your life gain payoffs, that is a huge deal. And Faith's Fetters is already good enough on its own. It is a splashable card. People will take this. You will not get this card 3rd, 4th pick, even if you're the only white drafter at the table. So keep in mind, if you see a Faith's Fetters and you're in white-black, you need to take it. Otherwise, you're not going to get another shot at it. And that's going to go ahead and do it. What do you think? Black-red, black-white, are they going to pan out? I think black-red's a little bit on the cusp because it only has 1 active treason effect, and it's an uncommon. So I don't think that deck's going to come together too often. It's going to be more like one of those black-red decks with a sub-theme of Sacrifice. And black-white seems a little more fleshed out, even though a lot of your power is in uncommons. So we'll see how that one works out. But it does seem a little bit more fleshed out and a little more focused than it has been in previous core sets. That's going to go ahead and do it. We'll see what 2 archetypes we're looking at next time. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful or informative or gets you ready for the pre-releases coming up or any arena events you'll be doing. Remember, you can subscribe below for more content like this or find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks where we can talk about it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.